Good morning. I'm Paula Horner, and actually you're going to have to listen to my speech first before we get to the chalice lighting that Gail is actually going to do. So, in any case, I'm the chair of the Disability Task Group, part of the Social Justice Council here at First Unitarian Universalist Church. The mission of the task group is to enable our congregation to become engaged, educated, and informed advocates for members, their families, and for others living with disabilities. It is in this spirit that we offer our service on mental health journeys. It seemed fitting to include this service in the month where our church theme is courage. The courage to get up every day and push through a myriad of strong, painful, or overwhelming emotions, and then to create beautiful music or poetry or art or just to be is worth celebrating. And in case you haven't heard, this congregation is number 4. We are the 4th congregation in the UUA to have completed credentialing and to be recognized as an AIM congregation, Accessibility and Inclusion Ministry. There were a number of elements that the task group thought I needed to include in this introduction, so for the next few minutes, I'm going to be your guide. First, I want to recognize Maggie OConnell Nolte, a member of our task group, who came to me a couple of months ago and said, I want to tell my story. And I said, go for it. And Maggie took on the task of spearheading this service with a little help from the rest of us. So thank you, Maggie, for doing this. Lori Helmers. Lori has been the past director of music at our church, and she'll be providing our music today. When Lori heard what the title of our service would be, she offered to select music that would support and augment this theme. As we go through the service, Lori will supply the backstory on the music that you will hear, and she promised to fill us in on that beautiful Rachmaninoff piece. Our readings today are 2 poems written by Carrie Nolte, Maggie's daughter. Carrie died almost 6 years ago of cancer. Carrie had many bouts of depression during her life and also wrote some amazing poetry about this. She fortunately enjoyed relief from her depression in her last years. Carrie will also be honored today at the Valentine Tea, so if you're here at 12, please come. We will have copies of Carrie's poetry down in the Commons. We have partnered with NAMI, the Southeast Minnesota chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, to put together this service. They will be the recipients of the Share the Plate during our offertory. Anita Osteris selected the book that Joyce Rude will be reading shortly. Anita will also be doing some activities in RE for the 3rd to 5th graders following the themes of the book. So if you are the parents of children in those grades, you might want to check in with them after church day and see what they were up to. Anita was also here last week and led 2 classes in RE for the 7th through 12th graders. Courtney Lawson, the executive director of NAMI, is also here. She'll be giving us an overview of mental illness as well as sharing her personal story. And during coffee hour, please stop by and thank Courtney and Anita for their generosity of their time. There'll be materials available about NAMI down in the Commons. So now I think we are finally ready to light our chalice and begin our service.
Good morning. Move the stool a little bit. My name is Courtney Lawson, and I'm here from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Southeast Minnesota, and we're a local affiliate of NAMI, and our mission is to improve the lives of people affected by mental illness through education, support, and advocacy. And I highlight one word in particular in our mission, and that's affected. 1 in 5 people will live with a diagnosable mental illness in their lifetime. I say diagnosable because only about half of those people will actually get the treatment that they need. And when I think about who's affected, it's all of us. Whether we're a family member, whether we're a friend, a coworker, a neighbor in the community with, or we live with mental illness ourselves. When we talk about mental illness, I think it's important to draw the distinction of what we're talking about, because the words are not always used in a way that all of us really understand. We have different perceptions. So one thing is starting out by defining mental health, which is our social, psychological, and emotional well-being. And this is something where all of us have some degree of mental health. And I like to say, if you have a brain, you have some degree of mental health. So hopefully we do, and we know a lot of people that do, although we may question that sometimes if everyone does. Mental illness is a medical disorder. It causes changes in our mood, the way that we think and behave and relate to others, our feelings, and our ability to function. And mental illness is something where we're quick to blame it for things like the awful tragedy that happened in Florida. The issue with that is that it shifts focus away from what the real problem is, which is not mental illness. Mental illness does not cause violence. In truth, people living with mental illness are more likely to be victims of a crime than perpetrators. There's sometimes a combination of a history of trauma and substance use and really severe mental illness that can play a very small role, but it's never just the mental illness. And that's quickly where our policymakers go and where the discourse goes is, oh, it's mental illness. And I was really proud of myself because I was on social media and I saw these comments and I thought, no, Courtney, just don't. This is not gonna turn out well, just don't. I made it 20 hours, I think it was Wednesday afternoon, that I finally just said, in case anybody wants to know the facts, here's some information that's research-based that talks about the non-link between mental illness and violence. And if you want to learn more, we actually have a mental health first aid class couple coming up, and there's information that I'll have downstairs. But what that shows me is that stigma still exists, and I'll talk more about how stigma has affected my journey later. But just to kind of recap and talk just a little more about what NAMI does, we are peer-based, and what that means is we're not mental health professionals, we're not therapists, we're not psychiatrists or social workers, but we're people with a lived experience. And NAMI was created as a grassroots organization by parents with children living with mental illness who wanted support because they felt like they couldn't share their story and find fellowship. And we maintain that focus now. Our programs include group support for families and people living with mental illness, one-on-one support, education, and we do things with age groups ranging from middle school on up, and advocacy. So we're really involved in one-on-one advocacy, helping people connect to the services that they need, but also becoming part of the larger conversation. And ultimately, we want to create a compassionate community that's inclusive of people living with mental illness and understanding. So when there are things like this most recent example, that's not where people's minds go, to this inaccurate information. So I appreciate being here today and having an opportunity to talk about NAMI.
My name is Maggie O'Connell Nolte. I'm a member of the Disability Task Force, and I've been a volunteer for NAMI Southeast Minnesota for almost 20 years. Now, some of you in attendance today have heard me tell about our family's journey with our daughter Carrie with mental illness. This is not that journey. This is my personal journey about major depression. During this journey, people have asked me at times, is depression real? Isn't everybody depressed at times? Well, I can tell you, yes, it's real, and yes, it's an illness, and yes, it can be a disability. The World Health Organization states that depression is one of the main causes of disability worldwide. Globally, it's estimated that 300 million people are affected by depression. 300 million. Having depression, major depression, has affected my life. I turned down things at work, opportunities with organizations, with my family, because I didn't have the energy, because I was overwhelmed. I missed some important events in my life during times of extreme sadness and uncontrollable crying. So, where did this major depression, when did this illness, this life-numbing depths of despair illness come into my life? It came slowly, unrecognizable at first, and sort of in stages. First, I think there was stress. And yes, everybody has stress, but at times, my stress seemed overwhelming for extended periods of time, and other activities that I tried became more and more mind-boggling difficult. Things I once enjoyed weren't that interesting, and I didn't care. I couldn't summon the energy. There were days I really had a hard time getting out of bed. And then that period, that episode would sort of subside a little, and I would go on. But I knew something was not right with me. I didn't really like this person I'd become. But it took me a long time to gain the courage to admit to myself that something wasn't right and to seek help. And when I sought help, I started some therapy, and I suspect it helped some, but I wasn't terribly invested in it at the time. Medication was suggested, and I said, no, I don't need to take medication. I can do something about this. But it did not improve. There was more sadness, less energy, less joy, and more sleep. So, what about medication? I had family and friends who had diabetes or heart problems who took medication. Maybe the meds could help me with my diagnosis of major depression. I started on medication. It was a long road of trying to find a medication that worked. Not unusual with psych medications. One made me sleepy, one gave me headaches, one gave me diarrhea. One didn't have side effects, but didn't do anything for me. So after about 9 months of trial, there came one that worked. I was alert, but calm, and life slowly became more manageable, and I didn't want to sleep as much. Now, the protocol for that medication was to taper off after 6 months to see if you really needed it. I tapered off. The symptoms of sadness and wanting to sleep certainly came back. But also another thing that can be a symptom of depression, and that's anger. And anger was there. I was yelling at things. So while this protocol was repeated a couple of times, it was finally my healthcare providers, doctor, therapist, psychiatrist determined that I was a person who would benefit probably from medication for depression for the rest of my life. And I've taken medication ever since. Now, it's changed occasionally when the meds stopped working, and at times, many times, I've went to therapy as needed, sometimes a few visits, sometimes for months. I still have a therapist on call that I see every now and then, and I do other life activities that help. I exercise, sometimes. Not as much as I should. I try to eat healthy. I do things I enjoy, like reading, making art, being with friends, taking classes, travel, having downtime, and I have benefited from mindfulness and gratitude awareness. NAMI has been helpful through the years for support, education, and being part of an organization that recognizes mental illness as an illness, not something that I'm just making up. NAMI has allowed me to share what I have experienced as a person with mental illness and as a family member with Carrie with mental illness. I have gained insight into this illness that has allowed me to help myself and others and to understand it is an illness not unlike diabetes or heart disease. And if treated, one can have a happy and rewarding life with living with major depression, as I have.
We have two poems today that were written by Carrie Rita Nolte. The first is entitled Depression. Depression is like watching a body of water at any given time of the day. 1 minute calm, then the atmosphere feels strange, suddenly ripped unaware. Water rolling back out into the dark and treacherous waters. Unable to hold grab of a lifesaver, I sink into shock, my body in hysterics, as I try to see what space and time I am in. I feel cold, sinking further into the depths of the ocean of madness. I shout, scream, silently, not to be heard underwater, so I hit and punch and kick and swear in my mind. Sudden anxiety makes my blood travel faster than my beating heart can keep up. I take a breath in comes water. Numb arms and legs give way to the current, leading me to a cold and silent death of depression. And the second, written by our dear Carrie, is entitled The Maintenance Man. The maintenance man forgot to come to work today. All the wires in my head are not connected right. This is what happens when I forget to take my meds. As a supervisor, I keep telling the maintenance man to work every day. Otherwise, I start to hear the voices in my head. I tell them to shut up and go away. I try sketching a page or two. The voices diminish some, but the maintenance man really needs to come to work tomorrow.
I'm now going to share my personal journey with mental illness because it played such a major role in getting me to NAMI in the first place. So I really consider that I had pretty much an ideal upbringing. My parents will have been married for 50 years next year, which is just pretty mind-boggling to me. And I realize my husband and I are going to both have to live for a really long time in order for that to happen. I have one brother. I grew up in a small town where everybody knew each other. My parents lived there and graduated from that high school. My grandparents on both sides lived there. So, everyone just knew and knew your family. So when I was getting ready to go to college, I decided that I just wanted to be a number. I didn't want to be known anymore. And I also knew that I wanted to go to Michigan State because obviously it's the best college there is, right? Just kidding. But when I went to college, I saw it as an opportunity to reinvent myself. Nobody knew me, and I could be the person that I wanted to be, which was just someone that was more interesting and outgoing and the life of the party. So when I got to college, I started drinking quite a bit. And I didn't think anything of it because that's just what I did in college. That's just what people do, or so I thought. I found that it made me feel less insecure and more like the person that I wanted to be. What I also didn't realize until later, but realized that it did, is it made me just generally feel better and calmer. Because later in high school, I started noticing that I would have this constant noise in my head. And I haven't thought of a better way to describe it in all the times that I've told this story besides just that. It was kind of like a static. It was always there. It was a disruption. And I found that when I drank, it would calm down. It would go away. So I ended up finishing college. I went on to grad school, and that's when the panic attacks started. And I started having panic attacks in any situation where I didn't feel like I was in control. It took me thousands of dollars to realize in therapy costs, something that a lot of people already know, but if not, I'll share it with you for free. You don't have control over a whole heck of a lot. The only thing I really had control over was my reaction to the situation. And my reaction to these situations in which I felt like I didn't have control was to have a panic attack. And panic attacks, if you have not experienced them, are horrible, and I hope you never do. I would feel like I couldn't get my breath, and I'd take such deep, gasping breaths that the next day I could feel in my chest just soreness from having this panic attack. My heart would pound, I would get all sweaty, and I would do anything to remove myself from the situation, which makes for some pretty awkward things when, you're at work and you're in a meeting and you're annoyed because people are talking too much. Instead of just being annoyed that people are talking too much, having a panic attack is a really much more dramatic way to make an exit. And in grad school, I noticed too that I'd be in class and I'd have to leave. So I thought something was up at this point. And I went to a doctor and was diagnosed with panic disorder, which is a type of anxiety disorder. I was prescribed medication, told to go to therapy. I thought, I don't need psychiatric meds, very similar to Maggie's story. And it's funny, too, when you think about if I was prescribed medication for some other health condition, if I would have the same reaction. I don't think that I would. I don't think I'd just opt out of taking medications that were prescribed for me. But I didn't, and I thought that only crazy people took medication. So over the years, it just got worse, and I started having some other things going on with just general impulsivity and reckless behavior, and I was drinking more and more because that was how I knew was a way to manage it. I later learned that this was a way for me to self-medicate, and that's more the rule than the exception with mental illness, is that often, in more cases than not, a person living with a mental illness will use substances as a way to just calm their minds and to get relief. So by the time I had what turned out to be my turning point, I had racked up 3 different diagnoses. So I had been to see psychiatrists and psychologists 3 times by this point. And then I had a bout of debilitating depression. And again, I was kind of in the, oh, really, depression? Is that for real? And then I learned, wow, yeah, it is for real. I couldn't get out of bed. When I had a good day, I would go from bed to the couch. I was sleeping all the time. Once in a while, I'd make it to work, but then I'd leave early or I'd come in late. I was just easily crying. I didn't know what was going on. So this stretched on for a couple weeks, and then it was a month, and then it was about 6 weeks. And this entire time I was had been dating my boyfriend for about 6 months. And he would ask, can I do something? What can I do? And my response was always kind of the same. I'm like, well, you can leave me alone, and that's what you can do. Like, go away, and that would be great. So really, really fantastic to be around at that point. During that time, or around that same time, my family had reached out and said that they were concerned about how much I was drinking. And I had this revelation that I had to get help, or I would put everything in jeopardy. I would put my job, my family, this relationship that I cared about. We had adopted a dog, and even my dog, I wanted to be a good parent to my dog, of course. So it's funny, the little things that play into what makes meaning in our lives. And so I went to see a doctor at that time, and she did an analysis and said, I think it's bipolar disorder. And my reaction was terror, because I knew people with anxiety, which was a diagnosis I'd gotten before. I knew people with depression. I didn't know anybody with bipolar disorder. I was pretty sure those people were crazy, that they were in straitjackets, in mental institutions, in like padded rooms, and that's where I was gonna end up. And I just wanted to be able to call my boyfriend and my family and tell them where I was before I was locked up forever. This was my reaction. I just had no idea. So at the same time, it was a relief, because I had some explanation for these things that I had done and this impulsive behavior and risks that I'd taken over the years, and looking back these many periods of depression, just ones that weren't as bad as the one that finally prompted me to get help. And I also started looking more and reading everything I could about bipolar disorder, just learning about it. And it was at that point that I got mad, because it's really like any other medical condition, and I didn't know why I had the reaction that I did, and I was mad that there was such a stigma that existed, and I wanted to do something about that. So one of the first things that I did in my treatment was to stop drinking, and to see if that was something that required more treatment. And thankfully, it was something that I was able to do with a lot of support of my friends. But it was really an adjustment in my life, because my whole life was built around that activity. And I thought, oh, people do that without drinking? How? I didn't do anything without drinking. And I started taking medication, which was quite an adjustment. I got really lucky with finding a combination that worked fairly early in the game, but I felt that it took away a part of me that made me me. It made me neat. I felt like it put out my fire. And that was really difficult, to kind of muscle through that and go through the time of learning that, no, I'm still in there. It's just, it quieted my brain, and I could actually think. And so that was amazing. So I stuck to it, and it's helped me tremendously. So when I became more stabilized, I found NAMI. And I found NAMI because I wanted to do something. And I found liberation in telling my story and being honest about my experience. And that has, I think, really helped as just part of my recovery and part of this journey. And now I do a lot of things that are oriented toward staying well. So one of the things that I've turned to is running. That's been really good for my mental health. And just self-care. Maggie mentioned a lot of great ideas around self-care. Sleep schedules are particularly important if you live with a mental illness, and even more so with bipolar disorder, to have those consistent. And so paying attention to my sleep, eating better, trying to reduce stress, being aware of my triggers, getting a support around me who could look for early signs that I might be cycling. And then part of it is realizing and accepting that mental illness is cyclical. And that can be really difficult because while I have it's much less up and down, there are still up and downs. I still have periods of depression. I still have periods of mania. And it's frustrating because you just think, I'm doing everything that I can. Are you kidding? Like, go away. And so just accepting that it's cyclical, but those periods are temporary and it will improve. And I think that when I reflect upon my story, there was a tremendous role of luck. I was lucky to not be involved in the criminal justice system. I easily could have been. I was lucky that I had a supportive family that revealed after I was diagnosed that there was a history of mental illness that nobody had ever talked about. But there was no, you shouldn't go to a therapist, or no, you shouldn't take medication. And I'm really grateful for that. I was lucky because I had access to health care, and I had enough literacy and know-how of how to navigate the system to be my own advocate and get the care that I needed. And it took me about a decade to get that diagnosis that was correct, finally, which is about average for mental illness between the onset of symptoms and the correct diagnosis. So and also when I think about it, I was really lucky because my boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband, played such a major role and continues to play such a role in my recovery. And when I look back and think about how he dealt with being with someone with untreated bipolar disorder for a year and some of the things that happened, it blows my mind. I'm still flabbergasted. I'm like, wow, I would have been out. Good for you. So my work at NAMI is really working toward a world where we're not so reliant on luck for recovery. And that's ultimately what I hope to achieve in my work there.